This lesson, we're going to talk about different relationships that organisms have in the natural environment. We're not quite talking about relationships like this, being complicated on Facebook. We're talking about relationships in the natural environment. Pause the video here and have a go at these three good questions, and we'll have a look at them together in class. All right, so in the study design, like I said, we're talking about relationships between organisms inside of it, and we're going to talk about beneficial relationships, harmful relationships, and benign, so not effective relationships between species that include what we call amensalism, commensalism, mutualism, parasitism, and predation. Okay? And then we're also going to talk about the interdependencies between species as represented by what we call food webs and food chains, including the impact of changes to these keystone species. All right, so obviously we as humans aren't the only organism to actually interact with other organisms. We like, for example, I might interact with my dog, but also lots and lots of different organisms on Earth interact with each other. In this interaction is what we call symbiosis, and symbiosis literally just means living together. Okay, like this monkey living with this dog. All right, the first kind of relationship we're going to talk about is called amensalism, and it's a bit of an unlucky relationship where we have one organism harming another organism, but that first organism is completely unaffected. A good example of this, it's not very common in nature, but a really good example is the mold called penicillin, right, which is an antibiotic mold, right? When it grows on agar like this, it stops the growth of gram-positive bacteria, which is this little white stuff that's on the outside of the agar. All right, so here's the penicillin, and as you can see, this white stuff isn't growing in this area over here. Okay, that doesn't benefit the penicillin. It doesn't eat the bacteria or anything. It simply just produces this antibiotic that prevents the growth of the bacteria. Okay, so the bacteria suffers, so they're sad, but the penicillin doesn't actually care, and that's amensalism. Commensalism, on the other hand, is a bit like the opposite of amensalism. It's a relationship where one organism is going to gain, but the other organism is actually completely unaffected. So it's actually a pretty good relationship. And there's two examples of this here. And the first one is clownfish, which actually live in this anemone, which is very poisonous, and the clownfish survive in the anemone. They're not actually poisoned by the anemone, but they actually can create a home in here and be protected from the outside environment. The anemone doesn't actually care that they live in there. It makes no difference to them. The other example here is barnacles, as you can see here growing on whales. These barnacles, they actually can feed off any little critters that live on the whale, but they actually don't really bother the whale too much. So it's another example of commensalism. All right, mutualism is my favorite kind of relationship. It's a relationship with both the organisms gain. It's a win-win for everyone. Best example of this, I would say, is bees and flowers. All right, bees actually feed off the pollen from flowers. All right, but they don't eat all of the pollen. Some of that pollen just gets stuck to their bodies and stuff, and that means that when they go from one flower to the next flower, they're actually going to fertilize that next flower with the pollen from the first flower, so they're going to actually help those plants reproduce, which is really great for both the bee who's eating food and the flower who's going to get to reproduce. And then another good example of this is the bacteria inside your gut. Right? There's very good bacteria in your gut that help break down milk, for example. Okay, without that bacteria, you couldn't break down the milk, and without you, the bacteria wouldn't have access to the milk as a source of food. Okay, both you and the bacteria in your gut all gain. All right, parasitism is a relationship where actually we're getting one organism winning whilst the other organism is being harmed, okay? A good example of this is mosquitoes on our skin. Right, if a mosquito goes and pricks you, it's going to get nice and fed, right? you're gonna get a nice scratchy lesion on your skin, so that's not gonna be good for you. So obviously mosquitoes are bad for us, but good for mosquitoes. Another example of this is this plant here, which is growing on this eucalypt. All right, that's not just leaves that have gone dry. That's actually a different kind of plant that's called the mistletoe, which you might have heard from Christmas movies and stuff. Mistletoes are actually a really horrible plant. They actually use their root system inside of the vascular system of the plant, right? And they just feed off this plant and take away its energy and take away its nutrients. And that's really horrible, obviously, for the plant, but really good for the mistletoe. All right. Predation is very much like parasitism, just in that we have one organism preying on another one, so one organism is gaining one and the other organism is being harmed. The difference between predation and parasitism is that in parasitism, the goal is to not kill your the organism that you're feeding off. So a mosquito doesn't want to kill the human. The mistletoe doesn't want to kill the parent plant. Okay? Predation, on the other hand, this cheetah is going to eat this little baby gazelle. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is energy flow within an ecosystem. So we actually can represent the flow of energy as a food chain, and how we do that is we talk about the energy flowing in a specific direction. The direction in this food chain is this direction, and we can see that because the grass is being eaten by the rabbit, so energy is flowing from the grass to the rabbit. Right? The fox is going to eat that rabbit, so the energy is flowing from the rabbit to the fox. Really important, that's the order you go. You don't put the arrows in the other way. We can add a slight more complexity to food chains, okay? And talk about the levels of the food chain. And you could do that in terms of order and trophic levels. Order is this representation in the middle here. At the very bottom of every food chain, we're going to have our producers. Okay, that's going to be the initial order of the food chain. And then we're going to have different orders of what we call consumers. Okay, so the producers are the things that photosynthesize. They're the things that create food from sunlight, and then the consumers are the things that eat those producers. So we have primary consumers, which eat directly the producers, secondary eat the primary, tertiary eat the secondary, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, obviously, if a hawk really wanted to, it could eat the mouse, and we could go straight from there to there. Okay, and that doesn't matter. All right, it's just all about how you've laid out your food chain. Trophic levels are a different way of organizing this same information. The only difference is that when you're talking about the trophic level, I'll put them on the side, the producers start off at the trophic level 1, and then you're just going to start counting up. Like this. Okay. Another thing that we can add to our food chains are decomposers or detritivores. Okay, and they're the part of the food chain which pretty much eat anything that died inside the food chain. Okay, so decomposer, we could say, is a order. Okay, but we can't include them in the trophic level, and the reason is this. Okay, if you look at this little food chain where we had that producer and it goes to the primary consumer, secondary consumer, all the way to tertiary consumer, it's sort of showing that from the tertiary consumer we're going to go to the decomposer, and that's true. But if this snake dies, that also goes to the decomposer. It doesn't actually matter where you are on the food chain. If you die, you end up going to the decomposer, and that's why we don't assign the decomposer a trophic level. When we actually take these food chains and link them all together, we can actually form a very large food web, which shows the flow of energy, the total flow of energy within an ecosystem. And here we have an example of a food web. We've got the producer, all right, and we can actually pull out different food chains out of the food web. So the producer this plant can be eaten by a goat, for example, and a goat can be eaten by the lion, but at the same time the goat could have been eaten by a jackal, and then, I don't know if lions eat jackals, but the lion could have eaten the jackal, for example. So as you can see, there are lots and lots of different food chains that interweave together to give you this one big food web, okay? In both food chains and food webs, we have what's called a keystone species, and a keystone species is really a plant or an animal that plays a very unique and crucial role in the way that whole ecosystem will function. And so we say often that without this keystone species, the ecosystem would be really dramatically different, or it could even cease to exist altogether. And this is where it's really important, our management of different species and such. Okay, examples of this are big cats inside of different ecosystems. They often control the populations of lots and lots of producers and of lots of consumers that are below them, and because they're controlling the population of those consumers, such as antelopes and stuff, they're actually controlling the population of a bunch of producers that are in that same ecosystem. All right. Another example of a very different type of keystone species are things like hummingbirds and bees. Okay, and why are they keystone species? Is because they're actually helping in the reproduction of a variety of different plants, and those plants are then going to be the producers, which are going to feed that first level consumer later on down the track.